Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution.
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 You want a revolution?
You say you want a revolution?
Revolution. The revolution.
It's going on right now.
Welcome to The Revolution, the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we ask today's most successful entrepreneurs to share the tools and strategies they use to build relationships and connections to grow their revenue. Now, your host for The Revolution, John Corcoran.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here, the host of this show, and such a privilege every week to get to talk to smart CEOs, founders, entrepreneurs of a range of different organizations. From recently interviewed the original CEO of Netflix. Go check out that episode. Activation Blizzard, LendingTree, OpenTable, YPO, EO, you name it. I'm also the co-founder of Rise25, where we help connect B2B business owners to their ideal prospects. And quick shout out today to previous guest Evo Terra, who told me that I had to go talk to today's guest because he's such a thought leader, such an expert in this nascent emerging industry of podcasting. So James Cridland, he's the editor of Podnews. It's a daily podcast newsletter. It is must reading if you are at all involved in this industry like I am. You got to subscribe. You got to read it on a regular basis to have your finger on the pulse of everything that is changing so quickly. He's a radio futurologist. He's a writer, consultant, public speaker on radio and new media's future. He's worked in radio and audio since 1989, so he's seen a lot of changes during that time. He's also an award-winning copywriter, radio presenter, internet strategist. Also, go check out the audio version of Podnews on iTunes or whatever podcast you listen to. And this episode, of course, is brought to you by Rise25 Media, where we help B2B businesses get clients, referrals, and strategic partnerships with done-for-you podcasts. I have been doing a podcast since 2010. I'm such a proponent. I'm an evangelist for this medium, James, as you are as well. I've been telling people since I started, look, you don't have to be the next James Rogan at all. Joe Rogan, sorry. You don't have to be the next Joe Rogan. Even if you don't get a big audience, a big following, it will change your life if you take the time to create a podcast. And it certainly has for me. So many great friendships, relationships have come from it. And so I feel so blessed to be a part of this industry. And I tell everyone that they should do it. So if you want to learn more, go to rise25media.com. All right, James, such a pleasure to have you here. And first of all, for those who don't know you or don't know what Podnews is, that's your most recent project in a long line of different things you've been involved in. But let's start there. What is Podnews and why should people subscribe to it?
Yeah, well, it's a daily newsletter which talks about podcasting. It's very much for people who are in the business of podcasting. It comes out every day, and the idea is that it's a short 2 or 3 minute thing that you can read to start your day if you're in the US. It's free to subscribe. You can get it at podnews.net.
That's great. And so you've been in radio or around radio and emerging podcasting from quite a long time, so going back to 1989. What brought you to radio to begin with? How did you get interested in it?
Oh, I think I was always interested in radio. So I remember when I was 6, and the new box of Frosties that came, a box of Frosties breakfast cereal with Tony the Tiger on the front came in. And if you saved up enough vouchers, you could send off to get yourself a Frosties radio. And so I thought that this was a brilliant idea. And so I saved up enough vouchers, sent off, and eventually through the post got a beautiful little portable AM radio, which was the most amazing thing. And I remember getting it for the first day, and I was listening to it and I thought, wow, there's all these voices and all this music and everything else. And then by the end of the day, I was really sad because I thought that I had used it all up, because I didn't understand that it wasn't just a recording. It was picking up signals through the air. I thought that I'd used everything up. So that was a mistake. And from that day, I was basically hooked. So you can blame Frosty's breakfast cereal for that. So at school, I did all of the things that you would do if you wanted to work in radio. So I did physics as a subject for the electronics side. I did politics as a subject for the journalism side, music as a subject as well. So you can see that I was very keen in getting involved in the radio business. And so I think you can trace it all back to that slightly weird set of breakfast cereal.
It's interesting,
a while back.
It's interesting you mentioned journalism because, if you had chosen to go into, let's say, local TV newspapers or local newspapers, it might have been a very different decision for you because, over the last 20, 25 years, there's been dramatic change in that industry. And at least from my perspective, it seems like radio has changed a lot, but maybe not quite as significantly. It's been affected by podcasting, but I don't think that it's been as much of a negative impact as much. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I think from the business side, newspapers were mainly kept afloat by classified advertising. That small advertising that people would take out to sell, their car or sell their house or whatever it might be.
It was the worst.
Yeah.
It was the most inefficient way of selling something. You'd have to call someone else and be like, okay, what color is the couch? How long is the couch?
Exactly. And as soon as eBay or Craigslist came along, of course, then that killed that part of the business for them. And of course, as soon as websites came along, that killed much of the benefit of reading a newspaper in the first place. So I think you had both of those things that radio never had. Radio never had classified ads. And radio was somewhere, by and large, that you would turn to for the human voice, not just for the spoken, not just for the written word. So, from that point of view, radio is actually surprisingly unaffected by all of this. So, if you look at American radio numbers, 9 out of 10 people used to listen to the radio 20 years ago. 9 out of 10 people listen to the radio now. Now, yeah, sure, they're listening to the radio for less time, but they're still, consuming radio, which I think is really interesting. And there are lots of people out there who have predicted radio's death. They predicted radio's death in the 50s when TV came along. In the late 70s when the Walkman came along, and so on and so forth. And when Napster came along, of course, radio was sure to die. And radio really isn't dying from that regard. What you obviously have is you have changes of habit, changes of consumption. And, we're listening to radio in different ways now. We want different things from our radio. I think that the legendary K-Fog in San Francisco is now no more because people wanted, something else. And I think, we're seeing an awful lot of change there. But the actual fundamentals of radio is something which is a human connection, which is a shared experience that hasn't gone away. And the business model, although the radio industry hasn't been very good in taking care of it, the business model is still there of allowing your audience to hear your message as an advertiser. And I think one of the fascinating things when you look at the data is that podcasting, yes, it's growing and growing dramatically, as I'm sure that we'll get onto, but you're not actually seeing too much eating into radio as a result. Sure, there's some, but actually, radio is still so much larger, both in terms of revenue and in terms of consumption than podcasting is. So podcasting's got a long, long, long way to go.
Do you think it's because of the nature of how we consume radio? Because people listen to it in the car, and up until recently, it's been kind of clunky to listen to podcasts in a car. Now car makers are starting to build apps directly into the car. So maybe that'll affect things. But do you think that's part of why radio has survived?
Well, John, I mean, I think, partially it's because of habit. I wake up, and I should apologize. The background noises that you're hearing is a great big tropical storm here in Brisbane, which is a lovely thing because we haven't had rain for about 4 weeks. So that's a good thing. But you will hear, it sounds as if there are elephants upstairs, but I promise you there aren't. I mean, I think habit has driven an awful lot of radio consumption, and habit is the thing that is very difficult to break. When we wake up, people of a certain age wake up to the radio. When we get in the car, the radio turns on automatically. It's just in there, isn't it? And so those habits are hard to break. And so there are lots of people who will turn around and say that, radio is dead, or radio is going to die in the next 2 years because of X, Y, and Z. And they forget that actually radio is a really strong habit, and people are very used to, it's part of their life experience. They're very used to spending half an hour with the radio in the morning as they get up, as they welcome in the new day, and they want to connect with other human beings. And I think, habit, clearly when you have a look at other apps and things, habit is the thing that drives stuff. So Twitter and Facebook and stuff are building that habit, building that addiction. And I think radio's always had that.
So this is fascinating, but you joined Virgin Radio in the 2000s, 2001 you joined, and you are involved in developing one of the first apps. This is pre-iPhone, but first apps that broadcast radio across phones and also podcasts. So talk a little bit about how you got involved in that.
Yeah, so I'd always been interested. I'd worked in radio at that point for more than 10 years, and I was always interested in what radio could do when joined up to the internet and new technologies. And when I joined Virgin Radio in 2001, I was looking after their website, which at the time was a tremendously popular thing. It was one of the, if not the most listened to internet radio station in the world.
Directly through the website.
Yeah, directly through the web. And there was another that was doing fantastically well, a radio station called Soma FM, which is run from California as well.
I remember that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's still going. But I think, Virgin was doing tremendously well. But one of the things that I was keen in doing was seeing how we could use mobile phones, which were beginning to get a little bit more sophisticated, whether there was an opportunity for us to do some interesting things there. So in 2005, we didn't really call it an app because they weren't called apps in those days. So we ended up calling it a 3G tuner. But if you had one of the 3 phones which were available to you at the time that ran a particular version of Symbian, then you could download using a wire and all kinds of complicated desktop software. You could download this app that would allow you to listen to the radio, and it would allow you to listen to the 3 channels that we were sticking out, one AM/FM station, and the other 2 were online only. And at the time, not only were there no app stores for mobile phones, not only was it really difficult to install an app, but also at the time, no mobile phones had Wi-Fi built into them. So you can imagine that not only were you
a ton of bandwidth and data.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So not only were you doing that, but 3G was relatively new, and although we called it a 3G tuner just to make it sound fun and exciting, we built it so that it worked on normal 2G connections. Now I don't know how boringly techie you are, but 2G essentially means that you get up to 9,000 kilobits a second, i.e. that's
blazing
not
hot
very
speed.
much at all.
Right.
That's not very much.
Right.
Sorry, 9 kilobits a second, not 9,000.
Ooh,
so
geez.
tiny amount. So the radio station we were encoding at 8K. So you can imagine it sounded as if it was underwater, and it cost more than I think at the time it would you about $20 an hour to listen in data costs.
Wow.
So
So it's a little bit before its time.
Yeah, not the most, and mobile phone companies at the time, the likes of AT&T or Sprint were busy saying to mobile phone companies, you may not put Wi-Fi into your, for the obvious reasons, because they wanted to make people would buy
The data
their
plans.
data plans. Yeah. So from that point of view, it was definitely before its time. I think, initially we were very excited when we got more than 5 listeners. But it certainly paved the way, I think, for where we are now. Radio on your mobile phone is a thing that quite a lot of people do.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was it like working for Virgin?
It was interesting. It was working for the Virgin brand, but not working for the Virgin company. So the way that most Virgin companies work is that Richard Branson comes along, sells his name to someone else,
Okay.
and that additional company then works with that brand. So a little bit different for Virgin Radio in that Richard had bought had set up the radio station initially. He'd got the radio station on the air and had then sold it weirdly to their breakfast DJ, and then a large Scottish company had bought it. So I was working for a quite dour, boring Scottish company, but also going and seeing the Virgin brand police, and they were very keen in making sure that all of the brand that Virgin was famous for, came across on the air, on the websites and everything else. So it was a great experience. But I think it taught me an awful lot about branding, an awful lot about understanding what individual brands stood for, and the benefit of having a strong brand.
Yeah. Now, you move on from there and you go to the BBC and you develop a iPlayer for radio for the BBC. So we're a couple of years further. And was that more advanced, or was that still ahead of its time?
Oh, that was beginning to be. I think the BBC was, the BBC's massive. So it has over 50% market share in the UK. So it's a really large organization, and does incredible things. 50 different radio stations in the UK, which I know doesn't sound like an awful lot, but the UK isn't very big. So, but one of the things I think that the BBC was doing is it wasn't first. Virgin was definitely first with everything. The BBC wasn't first, and they eventually basically said, no, we're not first with things, but we do things properly. Which I thought was an interesting way in. But, so the BBC was essentially moving some of the very old technology that it had used for streaming radio online, things like Real Player and Windows Media Player, and moving to a much more, integrated set of tools, and much more modern set of tools. So I was involved in that kind of thing, and particularly moving the sound of the stations from being crappy 32K real audio streams into great sounding 128K or more MP3 or AAC streams. So that was a great step forward. But it was a very strange time because I'd worked for Virgin Radio, 80 people working there. I'd moved to the BBC where there were 25,000 people, and it was a very different experience with all of the politics and the stuff that I was, obviously completely unprepared for.
What point did you start to pay close attention to podcasts as they came along, and how did they capture your attention?
So podcast was back in my Virgin Radio days, where I realized that there might be a way to use podcasting as another way to reach audiences. And particularly, there's an awful lot of reheated radio shows which are stuck out as podcasts. And I thought, having been a radio presenter in my past, I knew that there's this this thing called a snoop tape, which is essentially an automatic recording only when you open the microphones. So I thought maybe I can use that to produce a cut down version of The Breakfast Show to turn into a podcast. So it didn't have any music in there. It didn't have any travel news or all of that kind of stuff, and was just the good bits from The Breakfast Show, all of the talk breaks. So I thought, can I do that? And it turned out that yes, you could, and it was relatively easy to end up doing that. So we actually launched that in January of 2005. So to put that into context, Steve Jobs only put podcasts into the iPod in June of that year.
Wow.
So we were, prior to the iPod, we were there talking to people about, download Juice Podder and download all of these weird and wonderful podcatchers that you had to have at the time. But the podcast that we were producing, which was relatively automatic, did incredibly well. I mean, we were doing 15,000 downloads per episode relatively quickly, maybe because, it was a well-known brand and it was one of the first to be there. So that was really interesting. And I think from then on, I was always keen in both understanding what was going on in the podcasting world, but also seeing the benefits and the opportunities of podcasting, both from a large brand's point of view, but also, from a much more independent point of view as well.
Yeah. Let's talk about that, because there's been so many changes in recent years. There's been a lot of acquisitions, a lot of big money coming into the space. Talk about some of the big changes that have happened in recent years and kind of how that's affecting the landscape of podcasting.
Yeah, there's been so much money poured into podcasting, certainly over the last 3 or 4 years. And I think part of that is existing media companies wanting to defend their place in the ecosystem. So you've seen iHeartMedia or Odyssey, as Entercom is now called, jumping into podcasting with a real passion and buying podcast producers, making sure that the apps are there, making sure that the underlying ad tech stuff is also there as well. So there's been an awful lot of money in that. And then, of course, you've had other audio companies like Spotify and Deezer and those sorts of people, and Pandora, jumping in and going, okay, well, we should be involved in this as well. And again, spending a lot of time and a lot of money investing in this area too. So I think we've seen an awful lot of that. So it's the typical consolidation that you see when an industry is becoming more, more part of the normal mass media. So we've seen a fair amount of that going on. And I think that's been bolstered by just, the numbers coming out around consumption, the numbers coming out around money, and revenue into the business. So there's an awful lot of that going on as well. But it's a really exciting time, and I think as you look into podcasting, what podcasting was like 3 years ago, it was a very different world than where we are now.
At the same time, there's a lot more competition. There's a lot of big companies moving into the space.
Oh yeah.
Even some larger shows are seeing a lot of competition. So how do you see that shaking out going forward? Is it going to be harder for the indie podcasters? Is it going to become more mainstream, where it's kind of like traditional media, where you have the large media companies producing most of the shows that you see out there?
I think the exciting thing about podcasting is, certainly at the moment, anyone can launch a podcast and anyone can be on the same platform as any of those bigger shows. You can't say that about TV. You can't say that about radio, even newspapers and magazines. It takes a lot of money to print, newspapers and do all of that kind of stuff. So podcasting is a very level playing field, and it's likely to remain a level playing field for some time, because there's lots of people that still see the real benefit of, producing stuff in your spare room, and sticking it out on the internet on an RSS feed. And that's very exciting. That's something that podcasting has and no one else does. Now, of course, there are an awful lot more podcasts around these days. There are, more than 3 million podcasts available now, more than 2 million on Apple and on Spotify. So there's an awful lot of competition, if you like, for your ears if you're launching a new show. And that means that you have to be clever in terms of how you market it, how you tell other people about it, what you do to get people listening and following your particular show. But on the other hand, it's still a fantastic opportunity. And you can compare it, I think, to books and things like that anyone can produce a book. Anybody can get a book into a bookshop, actually. All of the systems are set up for that. Of course, the large brands, the large authors are always going to get center stage, but that doesn't mean that smaller smaller work doesn't also get noticed as well. So I think it's a really interesting and exciting industry because of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm such a huge proponent of doing a podcast, not just listening to them, but also actually doing them yourself. And I tell people all the time, it can seem easy to do, but to do it well, it takes some more work. It takes some thought. Which a lot of people jump into it, and it's a shame when I see someone not do it well for 6 months, get frustrated, and then quit. And I feel bad for those people, and I'm always sharing wisdom because I made a lot of mistakes in the first 4 or 5 years, and I almost quit myself. And I'm really glad that I didn't, because of all the, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I would. Yeah. There's so many great relationships. So what advice do you have to someone listening to this, thinking about starting a podcast? What should they do? What are the common mistakes you see?
Oh, I think, the number one common mistake, John, is that people just sort of research and
not starting.
Get a microphone, and then they might get a mixer, and then they might say, I don't know whether this microphone is right, and then they've read something that says that the microphone is wrong, and so they research again, and then they start researching the podcast host and all of that, and before you know it, 18 months has gone past, and you haven't started podcasting, and frankly, you haven't started practicing or learning your trade. That's the most important thing, is just get going. Just open the microphone, and it can be the microphone on your phone if you really want it to be, but open the microphone, get going, make stuff. You don't even have to put it out, but just make stuff and begin to understand what works, what doesn't, what works in your tone of voice, how to structure things. You'll very quickly know when a podcast has gone well, or when a podcast hasn't. You'll very quickly get feedback, if you ask for it. So just getting started, I think, is the most important thing. And we forget, as you say, we forget that people who are really good at their job, Joe Rogan, for example, I think he does a dreadful podcast, but many people like it. And the reason why he is so big, the reason why Spotify bought that podcast for $100 million is partly because Daniel Ek is mad, but also partly because Joe Rogan has been doing that job and being a stand-up comic and being a TV host and being a commentator and everything else for 15 years. He hasn't just popped up overnight and started doing an amazing show. So, just bearing that in mind, you won't become an instant podcaster, an instantly brilliant podcaster overnight. So it's a long, slow haul as you get better in your trade, as in any business. So that's, I think, the biggest issue. The other one is also wanting to monetize things really, really quickly. And how can I make money out of this? Actually, you make money out of this, by, in many cases, by being able to talk to people who you wouldn't be able to in the past, by being able to have those relationships, by being able to, meet new people. in many cases, that's how you make money out of your podcast. It's that branding for your own personal, your own personal brand, if you like. And I think quite a lot of people forget that, that is a quite acceptable way of earning money from what you do, and you don't have to turn around and instantly pepper your shows full of ads for mattresses or for insurance companies.
Right, which they're going to make $5 from anyways.
Yeah.
It's hardly anything. I want to ask you about the technology. There's so many changes happening in technology, and a lot of our clients that come to us because they're frustrated. They want to do a podcast, but it's so complicated. It's still complicated to this day, although it's gotten easier. It's still complicated getting something up in iTunes and all the different platforms. So that's a big frustration that people have. So what changes do you see happening in technology? Or even a better way of asking this is, if you could wave a magic wand and you could, flash forward a couple of years and podcasting has improved in some dramatic fashion, how would you like to see that change happen? What would be a big improvement?
Well, I mean, I think that there's two things which are holding the podcast industry back. One of them is Apple, because it is the most complicated thing to get your podcast into Apple Podcasts. If you're getting an ID, making sure that is a fully qualified ID with a credit card, making sure that you then do X, Y, and Z, and you make sure that you log into Apple Podcasts Connect, and then you have to wait for a bit, and then finally you get into there, and then the artwork is the wrong size, and then you have to wait a bit more, and it takes such a long time, to the point where quite a lot of podcast hosts are telling me now that they're seeing most people not bothering with Apple Podcasts anymore because it's just too difficult. And I think that's something that about 3 or 4 years ago, it wasn't the done thing to criticize Apple and to criticize the fact that they have not really invested any time and effort in making this business work rather better. You are seeing many more people criticizing Apple now, particularly after the rather botched changes that they've currently made in terms of how their new systems work. So I think that's one thing that really slows podcasters down. And that's why when you look at the amount of podcasts out there are over 3 million podcasts out there. 1.4 million are hosted on Anchor. And Anchor is a really simple, straightforward podcasting tool that they've built specifically to make it easy and simple. It gets rid of all of that Apple Podcast stuff. The old guard hate it because it's not doing it right. But they've got rid of all of the complicated Apple Podcast stuff. They've got rid of all of the complicated, you need this piece of software, you need to be encoding at this bit rate. They've got rid of all of that stuff, and they've just made it easy and simple. And I think more podcast hosts should be learning from that and making things as easy and as simple as they possibly can. And the difficulty is that Apple doesn't necessarily make that as easy as they could do.
The fear, of course, with something like an Anchor, though, is that they still have a free model. So what I'm afraid about with something like Anchor or other tools that are out there is that they're just going to shut down one day, and everyone who built their house on rented land is going to be, completely out of luck.
Yeah, but I would say that Anchor is owned by Spotify. Spotify has just posted its first profit in a while, so Spotify is making money. So and I think what Anchor's free model is there for is it's a very clever play by Spotify, if they use it correctly, of being able to nurture and spot new podcast talent and be able to go, oh, look, that particular show is doing really well in terms of downloads. Maybe we should sign them on. Maybe we should start selling ads in there. Maybe we should, elevate them to being a Spotify original. And so from that point of view, it's a very cheap R&D department for them in terms of content, in terms of content incubation. So I think, it's a very clever plan. Acast, which is a large podcast advertising company, they have done exactly the same thing. So they have a thing called Acast Open, which is a free podcast host, which does exactly the same thing. And if you are spotted in there, then they will grab your show and they will go out and sell it. So, I think from that point of view, that makes a bunch of sense. There have been lots of podcast hosts in the past who have promised free and have then gone away, but they haven't necessarily been backed by the same large companies as Anchor is. I mean, there's a fantastic podcast company based here in Australia called Whooshka, and Whooshka started with this thing which was called Forever Free. And it was their forever free plan, and you could get up to 5,000 downloads a month for free forever. And then a couple of years ago, it was changed to 1,000 downloads, and it was called their free plan. You can tell what's going to happen here, can't you?
Yeah.
And then finally, their forever free plan is no longer forever free, and indeed is no longer free because they don't have a free plan anymore. And I think, you can certainly see that that's the way of some of these free podcast hosts. But Acast is a large company; they're not going to fold that, and nor is Spotify. They're not going to get rid of Anchor either. So I think from that point of view, that's good.
And I promise if they do, I won't replay that clip of you saying that it'll never happen.
I mean, what you can see is that, what one of the problems is that, of course, you have, therefore, a lot of people who have gone into Anchor, who've tried it because it's so easy and it's free, who have put out a couple of podcasts, mostly called Test or Let's Talk, right. and have then given up and, and that's it. And all of those podcasts are in all of the podcast apps. Right. And at some point, somebody needs, I think, to take a stiff broom and brush all of that old stuff out. Right. But that might be, that might be an interesting conversation. But it is something that we'll have to do at some point in the future.
I mean, even with Anchor, you could argue that there's still opportunity in the podcasting space for other companies to come in and help with other challenges people have. Because just creating it, putting it up in Anchor and in iTunes and everything isn't enough. Because you can do that. And then I see lots of Anchor shows that aren't getting any exposure. And then how do you share it on social media? And how do you turn it into micro content, all that kind of stuff. So other companies, I think, are tackling those other pieces. But we're running a little short on time. So I want to wrap things up. First, I want to ask you, James. So I'm a big fan of combining content and relationships. Using your content as an excuse to further relationships people you already have, or as in the case of us, meet new people, have a great conversation. So for those who are listening to this and thinking about doing a podcast, what advice do you have for them specifically around how you can use content and networking / relationship building?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of conferences which are actually entirely full of this. It's entirely full of growing your own network. And, and Jordan Harbinger does a great session on how to build a relationship network, how to keep in touch with people. He's got a complicated set of tools of, when was the last time I spoke to John? It was 3 weeks ago. I should set myself a reminder in my diary for the next week to then make sure that I'm back in contact, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff that goes on. I have to say, I found it very interesting from my side, in that I do an audio version of the newsletter that I do. But of course, that's just me, and it's just me talking for 3 minutes, and you can ask your smart speaker for it, and that's basically it. I started doing a podcast about 6 months or so ago called Podland, and I do it with a friend of mine called Sam, who's based in the UK. And that has a lot of interviews in there. They're very short interviews, deliberately so. And that's been really interesting because all of a sudden it's given me the excuse to ring people and talk to people, and ring people who I've been writing about and who are already aware of me, but actually talk to them, have a better relationship with them. And so that's been really helpful. And so I would certainly say, I would certainly say that it's a useful tool to grow the relationships that you have. I would also say, as a Brit and as somebody who, who has sort of grown up with the British way of doing things, we in British radio certainly have always had a view that the listener comes first. That the audience comes first. And so I always find it slightly uncomfortable when people say that they're in podcasting, not because of the audience, but because it's a good excuse for them to talk to other people. I mean, at the end of the day, obviously what you need to be doing if you want to make a great, successful podcast is to make a great, successful podcast.
Right. I've got a cure for that, by the way. I feel the same way. But what I say to people all the time is, you should do the podcast because it's valuable for you, whether you get a huge following, whether you get a huge audience or not. Hopefully you will. But even if you don't, it should still be valuable for you to do it. And that's the way I feel. I hope people listen to it. I'm glad to have listeners, but I would still do it even if no one is listening, because I get to meet amazing people like yourself.
Yeah. And I guess I'm kind of there from the other side going, I would like to make sure that as many people as possible listen to what it is that I do, and work and that I produce a great product for them. And so, but it's as you say, it's a different sort of mindset in terms of how that works. Yeah. So I want to ask, so two last questions. I'm a big fan of gratitude. So if you look around at your peers, however you want to define that, others in your industry, who do you admire? Who do you respect who's out there? Oh, I think, there's a bunch of people out there. There's a bunch of shysters out there, and a bunch of very unpleasant, negative people. But there are also a bunch of people who are, really good at what they do. I might not necessarily agree with them all the time, but really good at what they do and very, very helpful. There's a podcast consultant out there called Dave Jackson, who is the nicest man, but also says the most intelligent things around podcasting, and is always trying to help people. And I think that there's certainly some people out there who are very keen on pointing out how wrong you are and how you should buy their product and everything else. And Dave isn't one of those people. Dave is one of those people who just genuinely wants to help people. So so I think he is very bright and clever. I think also there are a lot of good business people out there. Mark Asquith, who's the CEO of a podcast host called Captivate, which I'm an advisor for. He is, one of the cleverest sort of thinkers in terms of where he takes his business and where he moves his business forward. And I found working with him very, very rewarding because of that. So, I think, a lot of this comes back to just thinking and sharing, and not just being in it for yourself, but actually understanding that when you help other people, there's a real halo to what you do there.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is exactly what you do. So thank you for what you do. Final question. All right. So let's pretend we're at an awards banquet, like the Oscars, the Emmys. You are being awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award for everything you've done up until this point. What we all want to know is, who do you thank? In addition to family and friends, who are the colleagues, who are the friends, who are the mentors, who are the peers, who are the business partners, who are the people you would acknowledge in your remarks?
Yeah, and it's and that's an interesting question. You asked me that before we came on, and I thought, what on earth am I going to say? And you're asking me that again now, and I'm thinking, what on earth do I say? I mean, I think there are a few people. There's a guy called Steve Taylor who I once worked for when I was working at a tiny little radio station in the north of England, and and Steve was working there as well, and he was a lovely man that all of a sudden realized that I had moved to London, and he was working at Virgin Radio, and he said, you should come and run our website. And I had not not run a website, not really looked after a team of people that well before, and so, so people like Steve are obviously people that give you that, that opportunity. And obviously I'm very grateful to him. But I think, lots of different people who have been, who have just sort of kept on nudging me and kept on sort of moving me forward, and far too many to mention, but Steve would be probably quite high in that.
Excellent. All right. Well, James, this has been a pleasure. Where can people go to learn more about you, connect with you, subscribe to Podnews? Yeah,
well, you should go to the Podnews website, which is at podnews.net, or you can ask your smart speaker to play the latest news from Podnews, podcasting news. So that's one thing. You should also get my longer form podcast, which is called Podland, which you'll find in all of your favorite podcast players and Spotify.
Excellent. All right, James, thank you so much.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you, John.
Thank you for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast with John Corcoran. Find out more at smartbusinessrevolution.com. And while you're there, sign up for our email list and join the revolution.
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 And be listening for the next episode of the Smart Business Revolution podcast.